Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I was living in a small, old apartment building on the outskirts of my college town. It wasn't fancy, but it was cheap and close enough to campus to walk. The building was quiet, usually inhabited by students and older couples. I'd lived there for about 6 months, and nothing had ever seemed out of the ordinary until one night in October. It was a Thursday, and I'd stayed late at the library cramming for midterms. By the time I got home, it was almost midnight. The streetlights cast eerie shadows on the cracked pavement as I walked toward the entrance of my building. I felt a slight chill, but brushed it off as the October air. As I unlocked the front door and stepped into the dimly lit hallway, I noticed something strange. A man was standing at the far end of the corridor, partially hidden in shadow. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his back to me. I froze, my keys still in my hand. The man didn't look familiar, and I knew everyone in the building at least by sight. He was tall and wearing a dark hoodie that obscured most of his features. I hesitated, wondering if I should say something, but the longer I stared, the more uneasy I felt. Trying to act casual, I quickly walked to my apartment, which was thankfully only a few doors down from the entrance. As I unlocked my door, I glanced back. The man hadn't moved. I went inside, locked the deadbolt, and exhaled a shaky breath. Maybe he was just waiting for someone, I thought, trying to calm myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I turned off the lights in my living room and peeked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. Maybe he'd left. Relieved, I decided to shower and get ready for bed. About 20 minutes later, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A soft, scratching sound coming from my front door. My heart stopped. I sat up, holding my breath. The sound came again, long, deliberate scratches, as if someone was dragging their nails down the wood. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the door. The scratching stopped, then came a quiet knock. Who was it? I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I looked through the peephole again, but all I could see was darkness. Whoever it was had covered the peephole. I backed away, my mind racing. Should I call the police? Before I could decide, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, walking away from my door and down the hallway. I stayed up all night, listening for any sound of him coming back. The next morning, I told my landlord about what happened, and he promised to check the security cameras. Later that day, he called me, his voice unusually tense. I don't know how to tell you this, he said, but the cameras didn't catch anyone entering or leaving the building around the time you got home last night. And there's no footage of anyone standing in the hallway. The story didn't end when I moved out. I'd like to say that leaving that apartment erased the memory of what happened, but it didn't. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in my new place. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Every strange noise made me jump. I chalked it up to paranoia until something happened that made me question everything. About a month after I moved, I received a package I hadn't ordered. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. The handwriting on the label was shaky, almost childlike, and spelled my name perfectly. My stomach churned as I stared at it. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a single item, a photograph. It was a picture of the hallway outside my old apartment, taken from the perspective of someone standing at the far end, the same spot where I'd seen the man. There was no one in the photo, just the empty corridor bathed in dim yellow light, but something was written on the back of the picture in the same shaky handwriting. Miss May. I felt sick. How did this person know where I lived now? How did they even know I had moved? I immediately called the police and filed a report. They took the package and photo as evidence, but I could tell by the officer's skeptical expression that they didn't think much would come of it. After that, I became hypervigilant. I changed my routines, never walked anywhere alone, and started locking every door and window even during the day. Weeks passed without any further incidents, and I started to relax, thinking maybe whoever it was had finally lost interest. Then, one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, the faint glow of my bedside lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. It was quiet, too quiet. When I heard it, the unmistakable sound of scratching, faint but deliberate, coming from my front door. My blood turned to ice. I wanted to get up, but fear held me down, pinning me to the mattress. This time, I didn't call out. I didn't dare move. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, though it was likely only a few minutes. Then came the knock, soft, almost polite. My chest felt like it was going to explode from the pressure of holding my breath. I reached reached for my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The operator stayed on the line with me as I whispered what was happening. I didn't dare approach the door or look through the peephole. I just stayed frozen in my room until I heard the knock again, this time louder, more insistent. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, the hallway was empty. No sign of forced entry, no marks on the door, nothing to indicate someone had been there. The officers assured me they would patrol the area and advised me to stay somewhere else for the night. I took their advice and crashed on a friend's couch. The next morning, I returned to my apartment to find something waiting for me. Taped to my door was another photograph. This one was of me asleep in my bed. The police took the new evidence seriously this time. They told me to pack a bag and stay somewhere safe while they investigated. I stayed with friends for weeks, too terrified to return. Eventually, I decided it wasn't worth the anxiety and broke my lease. I moved to a new city, far away from anyone who knew my old address. To this day, I don't know who it was, how they found me, or what they wanted, but every so often, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I heard a knock. Even after moving to a new city, I couldn't shake the fear. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, it felt deeper, more ingrained, like a permanent scar. For months, I avoided making friends or sharing too much about myself with anyone. I'd even kept my workplace vague when talking to neighbors. My therapist said it was PTSD, which made sense, but knowing that didn't make it any easier to sleep at night. The first 6 months in my new place were uneventful. Slowly, I started to relax. I didn't hear any strange noises, no mysterious packages arrived, and I began to believe that maybe I left it all behind. Maybe whoever or whatever had been stalking me finally gave up. I started feeling like a normal person again. Then it happened. It was a Saturday night, and I'd gone out with coworkers for drinks. It was the first time I'd really let loose since everything happened. I came home late, a little tipsy but happy. As I walked into my apartment, I kicked off my shoes, locked the door, and headed to the kitchen for some water. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a single, muddy footprint in the middle of my living room. It wasn't mine. The footprint was too big to belong to me, and the tread pattern didn't match any of my shoes. It looked fresh, as if someone had just stepped there moments before. My heart began to race as I scanned the room. Everything looked normal, nothing was out of place, but that didn't comfort me. I backed out of the living room and grabbed the largest kitchen knife I could find, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. I whispered to the dispatcher that someone had been in my apartment. They told me to stay on the line and hide until the police arrived. I locked myself in the bathroom, clutching the knife and holding my breath. Every creak and groan of the old building made my heart pound. I was convinced whoever left that footprint was still in the apartment, hiding, waiting. The police arrived quickly, but their search turned up nothing. No sign of forced entry, no one hiding in closets or under the bed. They looked at the footprint and suggested it could have been an old mark I hadn't noticed before, maybe tracked in by a maintenance worker. But I knew better. The footprint wasn't there when I left that evening. Someone had been inside while I was out. The police installed extra locks on my doors and advised me to get a security system. I followed their advice, even adding cameras inside and outside my apartment. For weeks, I felt like I was under siege in my own home, constantly checking the footage for any sign of someone lurking nearby. One night, as I was reviewing the day's recordings, I saw something that made my stomach drop. At 2:37 a.m., while I was sound asleep, the hallway camera outside my apartment captured a figure standing outside my door. It was blurry, but the person was tall, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over their face. They stood there for several minutes, motionless, before leaning down as if to listen at the door. Then they turned and walked away. The footage sent me spiraling into a panic. I sent it to the police, but by the time they arrived, the person was long gone. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but it didn't feel like enough. That night, I didn't sleep. I packed a bag and stayed in a hotel, then made plans to move again, this time without telling anyone where I was going. I'm writing this now from another new apartment in another new city. It's been a year since I last saw the footage of the man outside my door. Maybe it's over, maybe they finally stopped, but I still can't shake the feeling that it's not over. I double check my locks every night, and I never leave home without looking over my shoulder, and sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I hear a faint knock at the door. I was home for summer break, staying with my parents in the small, rural town where I grew up. Our house was on the edge of a dense forest, and I always loved exploring the trails there. It was peaceful, quiet, and a great way to clear my mind. That summer, though, I had an experience that made me never want to go back. One afternoon, I decided to take a long hike. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a flashlight, just in case. I let my mom know where I was going and headed out. The weather was perfect, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I felt at ease as I wandered deeper into the woods, following a trail I'd been on dozens of times before. After about an hour, I came to a fork in the path. Normally, I'd go right toward a small lake, but for some reason, I felt like going left. I hadn't been down that trail in years, and curiosity got the better of me. The path was overgrown, but I pushed through the bushes and kept walking. It felt exciting to be somewhere I hadn't been in so long, almost like an adventure. About 20 minutes in, I started to notice something odd. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the wind, had quieted. It wasn't completely silent, but it was noticeably different. I told myself I was imagining things and kept going. That's when I saw it. Ahead of me, just off the trail, was a small clearing. In the center was a wooden structure, almost like a shack or a hunting blind. It was old and looked like it had been there for years. I'd never seen it before, and I was certain it hadn't been there the last time I'd hiked this trail. Curiosity got the better of me again, and I stepped off the path to get a closer look. The shack was crude, made of weathered wood and rusted nails. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. Still, I leaned closer to peek inside. The interior was dark, but I could make out a few objects: an old chair, a filthy blanket on the floor, and what looked like empty food wrappers scattered around. It reeked of rot and mildew. I decided I'd seen enough and turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They were faint but deliberate, coming from deeper in the woods. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the trees, but I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps got louder, closer. Then I heard a voice, low and gruff. "Hey, what are you doing here?" I spun around and saw a man emerging from the trees. He was tall, unkempt, and had a wild look in his eyes. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he was carrying something in his hand, a hatchet. I stammered something about being lost, my mind racing. The man just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I turned and bolted back toward the trail, not daring to look back. I could hear him yelling after me, but I couldn't make out the words. My only focus was on getting away. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I made it back to the main trail and then to the edge of the woods. I didn't stop until I was inside my house, slamming the door behind me. My mom was startled and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't even explain. I just said I'd seen something in the woods and didn't want to go back. I later told a friend about the shack, and he said he'd heard rumors about someone living in the woods, an old hermit or drifter who didn't like people trespassing on his land. I don't know if that's who I encountered, and frankly, I don't care. All I know is that I never went back to that part of the forest. The days following the encounter were rough. I couldn't shake the image of the man from my mind. His dirty clothes, the way he smiled like he knew something I didn't. I kept telling myself I was safe, that I'd gotten away, but a part of me felt like I'd left something unfinished. Who was he? Why was he out there? And most importantly, what would have happened if I hadn't run? A week passed, and I started to feel a little more normal. I avoided the woods entirely, even though they were a huge part of my life growing up. I stayed close to home and made excuses when my friends asked me to go hiking or camping. I didn't want to tell anyone what happened. It sounded crazy, like something out of a bad horror movie. One night, though, something happened that pulled me right back into the fear. It was late, maybe around midnight. My parents had already gone to bed, and I was in my room scrolling on my phone. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the old wood floors. I just started to doze off when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the window. At first, I thought it was just tree branches swaying in the wind, but then it happened again and again. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be the wind. My heart started pounding as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard something else, footsteps, this time outside, moving along the side of the house. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone and crept to the window, staying low so I wouldn't be seen. Slowly, I peeked out, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Still, I knew someone was out there. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel eyes on me. It was the same feeling I'd had in the woods, that sense of being watched. Trying to keep calm, I texted my dad, who was just down the hall. "Someone's outside. I think they're at my window." Seconds later, I heard his door open, followed by the unmistakable sound of him cocking his old shotgun. He flicked on the floodlights outside, and I heard him shout, "Who's out there? Show yourself." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the woods at the edge of our property, I heard movement, branches snapping and leaves rustling, like someone running away. My dad stood on the porch for a while, scanning the tree line, but whoever it was had disappeared into the night. The next morning, we found footprints in the dirt outside my window. They were large, clearly made by a man, and they led straight to the woods. My dad called the local sheriff, who came out to take a look. The officer was nice enough, but didn't seem overly concerned. "Probably just a drifter," he said. "We get them around here here sometimes. Nothing to worry about. But I was worried. The prints were fresh, and they were too close to my window for comfort. I couldn't prove it, but I knew it was him, the man from the shack. Somehow, he'd found out where I lived. After that night, my dad installed extra locks on all the doors and windows, and we made a habit of keeping the floodlights on at night. I didn't see or hear anything unusual for the rest of the summer, but I never truly felt safe again. When it was time to go back to college, I left with a sense of relief. I still come home to visit my parents, but I avoid the woods entirely. Even now, years later, I get chills thinking about that summer. Who was that man and what did he want? I'll probably never know. Years passed, and the encounter slowly faded into a memory, though the unease never quite left me. I graduated from college, got a job, and moved to a nearby city. I visited my parents occasionally, but I always avoided staying overnight, using work as an excuse. The woods no longer felt like the safe haven they once were. Then, about 2 months ago, my mom called me out of the blue. Her voice had an edge of nervousness I hadn't heard before. "Do you remember that weird man in the woods?" she asked. My heart sank. "Yeah, why?" She explained that my dad had been out back, doing some yard work near the tree line, when he noticed something strange, a small pile of objects neatly arranged at the base of a tree. When he looked closer, he saw they weren't just random items. There was an old, rusted knife, a crumpled piece of paper with my name scrawled on it, and a small bundle of twigs tied together with twine. It looked like some kind of crude effigy. My dad hadn't mentioned it to her at first, thinking it was just a prank or coincidence. But when he found a second pile a few days later, this time with what looked like a torn piece of fabric from a shirt I left at their house years ago, he decided it wasn't something he could ignore. Fury, this sent me into a full-blown panic. I told my mom to call the sheriff immediately, but she hesitated. What if it's just some kids messing around? She said, "I don't want to bother anyone if it's nothing." I insisted, and thankfully she listened. The sheriff came out, took some photos, and filed a report. He promised to have someone patrol the area more frequently, but there wasn't much else he could do without more evidence. A week later, my dad called me this time. His voice was low, like he didn't want my mom to overhear. "We found a trail camera," he said. Apparently, while clearing some brush near the edge of the woods, he'd stumbled upon a small, camouflage trail camera strapped to a tree. It wasn't his, and he'd never seen it before. He brought it inside and tried to check the footage, but the memory card was missing. Someone had been watching the house. That was the final straw for me. I told my parents they needed to get out of there, at least for a while. They were reluctant. They'd lived in that house for decades, and moving wasn't something they wanted to consider. But I was terrified for them. Things went quiet for a while after that. No more piles of objects, no strange noises in the night. I started to think maybe whoever it was had moved on. But then, last week, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just a plain envelope with my name on it. Inside was a single piece of paper with 5 words scrawled in uneven handwriting. "You can't hide forever." I immediately called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. The envelope didn't have any fingerprints or clues to who had sent it. I knew in my gut it was him. Now, I'm living with this constant anxiety, checking my locks 3 times before bed, looking over my shoulder wherever I go. My parents finally agreed to install security cameras around their property, but they still refuse to move. I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. To the man in the woods, wherever you are, I don't know what you want, and I don't care. Just leave us alone, and let's not meet ever again. I lived in a small, quiet town at the time, working late shifts at a diner. My shifts often ended around midnight, and since I didn't have a car, I'd walk home, which took about 20 minutes. One night, as I was walking down the main road toward my apartment, I noticed a red car parked under a flickering streetlight. I didn't think much of it at first. Cars parked along the road were unusual, even late at night, but as I got closer, I noticed a man sitting in the driver's seat. He was staring straight ahead, not moving, and the engine was off. I felt uneasy, but I convinced myself it was nothing. People have every right to park their cars and sit in them, right? I kept walking, trying not to look directly at him, but as I passed, I felt his eyes on me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. About a block later, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine starting. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the red car pulling out and driving slowly in my direction. Panic started to set in, but I kept walking, trying not to let my fear show. Maybe he's just going in the same direction, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But as I turned down a quieter street toward my apartment, the car turned too. It was moving at a crawl, keeping pace with me. My mind raced. I didn't want to go straight home. If he was following me, I didn't want him to know where I lived. So I decided to take a detour and head toward a gas station that stayed open late. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now. The car sped up too. That's when I heard the window roll down and the man called out, "Hey, you need a ride?" "No, thank you," I shouted back without turning around. He didn't stop. He kept following me, his car now creeping just a few feet behind me. "Come on, don't be like that. Let me give you a ride. It's not safe out here. I ignored him and broke into a full sprint, heading for the gas station. My chest was tight with fear, and I could hear the car speeding up behind me. I thought for sure he was going to hit me or block my path, but then I saw the bright lights of the gas station up ahead. The red car suddenly slammed on the brakes. I glanced back and saw it make a sharp U-turn before speeding off into the night. I stumbled into the gas station, shaking and out of breath. The cashier gave me a concerned look as I explained what had happened. He offered to call the police, but I declined. At the time, I was too scared to think clearly and convinced myself it was over. I stayed at the gas station for about an hour until I felt safe enough to walk home. After that night, I started being extra cautious on my walks home. I began taking different routes every night, even though it added extra time to my journey. I also started carrying a small can of pepper spray, just in case. For a few weeks, everything seemed fine. I didn't see the red car, and I started convincing myself that it had just been some creep who decided to move on. But then one night, something happened that brought all my fear rushing back. It was a Friday, and the diner was busier than usual. I ended up staying late to help clean up, so it was nearly 1 a.m. by the time I left. The streets were completely deserted as I started my walk home. The air was heavy and still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. About halfway home, I heard the faint sound of tires behind me. My stomach dropped. I didn't even need to turn around to know it was him. The car's engine was quiet, but the steady, deliberate pace of the vehicle trailing me was unmistakable. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and there it was, the same red car. My heart was pounding in my ears as I tried to think. I could run, but where? There was no gas station nearby this time, and I didn't want to lead him to my apartment. I spotted a narrow alley up ahead and decided to take my chances. Maybe I could lose him. I darted into the alley and started sprinting, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The alley twisted and turned, and I could hear the car's engine revving as it tried to follow from the adjacent street. I was almost out of the alley when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The red car was waiting for me at the other end. I froze, my mind racing. He must have known this alley led back to the main road. As I stood there, paralyzed, the driver's door opened and the man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, and his face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. "Why are you running?" he called out, his voice cold and even. "I just want to talk." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run the other way, but before I could move, I heard another voice behind me. "Hey, what's going on here?" I turned to see a man walking his dog, staring at the red car and its driver with suspicion. The man in the red car hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the dog walker. Without a word, he got back in his car, slammed the door, and sped off. The dog walker stayed with me until I calmed down and called the police. This time, I filed a report and gave them as much detail as I could about the man and his car. They promised to patrol the area more frequently, but they never found him. After I moved, things were peaceful for a while. I found a new job and an apartment in a much busier area of a nearby city. It felt good to finally be somewhere I didn't feel the constant need to look over my shoulder. I even convinced myself that the man in the red car was a distant, eerie memory, something I could leave behind like the small town I'd escaped from. But then, about 6 months after I'd settled into my new place, I received a package. It was a small, nondescript brown box with no return address. At first, I thought it was a delivery mistake. I wasn't expecting anything, but curiosity got the better of me, so I opened it. Inside was a single item, a cheap plastic keychain in the shape of a red car. My heart dropped. My mind immediately raced back to that night and the man who had followed me. There was no note, no explanation, just the keychain. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. I threw the keychain away, locked all my doors, and spent the rest of the night trying to rationalize what had happened. How would he know where I lived? Was it really him, or was I just being paranoid? Either way, I decided not to take any chances. The next morning, I reported it to the police. The officer I spoke to took me seriously, which was a relief. He told me to be cautious and to keep any further packages or correspondence that might arrive. He also suggested changing up my routines, like when I left for work or came home, and recommended installing a security camera. I followed his advice to the letter. Weeks went by and nothing else happened. I started to relax, thinking maybe it really had been a coincidence. But then, one evening as I was coming home, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Parked a few houses down from my apartment was a red car. It wasn't the exact same one. I'd memorized the old one's shape and details, but this one was eerily similar. The windows were tinted, and I couldn't see inside, but it felt like someone was watching me. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, debating whether to go inside or keep walking. I decided to keep walking. I circled the block and called a friend, asking them to come meet me. When we returned together about 15 minutes later, the car was gone. At this point, I knew I was being watched. I doubled down on my security measures, adding extra locks, upgrading my security camera, and even sleeping with a weapon close by. I also started carpooling to and from work with a coworker, making sure I was never alone. For a while, nothing happened, no more packages, no sign of the car. I began to think maybe he had moved on, but then, one night while reviewing my security camera footage, I saw him. The man was standing in my driveway, just outside the camera's range, staring at my apartment. He was wearing the same dark jacket and hood. He stood there for several minutes, motionless, before slowly walking back toward the street. I couldn't see where he went, but it was enough to shatter any sense of safety I had left. I called the police immediately and showed them the footage. They promised to patrol the area and keep an eye out, but they admitted there wasn't much they could do unless he directly threatened me. That was the last straw. I packed up and moved again, this time to a new city in a completely different state. It's been over a year since then, and I haven't seen or heard anything unusual, but I still live with the lingering fear that he's out there, waiting, watching, planning. To the man in the red car, I don't know who you are, and I don't care to know, but if you ever come near me again, I won't run. I'll be ready. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I was about an hour away from my house. The road I was on was long, mostly surrounded by trees, with only the occasional flickering streetlight. I had my music playing low and was sipping on the cold coffee I picked up at a gas station earlier when I saw something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe trash someone had left, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a man. He was waving his arms in a slow, almost robotic motion, signaling for help. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. My gut told me to keep driving, but I couldn't help feeling bad. What if he was hurt or stranded? I stopped the car a little ahead of him and cracked my window just enough to talk. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. The man jogged up to my window. His clothes were dirty, his face pale, and his eyes. There was something wrong with his eyes. They didn't seem to focus on me, as if he was looking just past me. I ran out of gas. He said in a monotone voice, "Can you give me a ride to the nearest station?" My skin crawled. Something about it just felt off. I glanced at the road behind me, completely empty. No other cars, no witnesses. "Sorry," I said quickly, "but I can call someone for you." He tilted his head, staring at me for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's okay," he said softly. "I'll just wait." He backed away from my car, but he didn't step off the road. Instead, he just stood there watching me. His hands hung limply at his sides, and his smile stayed fixed on his face. I didn't waste another second. I drove off, keeping an eye on him in my rearview mirror. As my car gained speed, he turned and started walking down the road in the opposite direction. A few minutes later, I saw headlights approaching from behind. Relieved that someone else was on the road, I slowed down slightly, but as the car passed me, I noticed something chilling. It was the same man. He was sitting in the passenger seat of the car, staring directly at me. I don't know how he got picked up so quickly or how he managed to be in that car, but I didn't stick around to find out. I floored it and didn't stop until I reached my driveway. After that night, I tried to convince myself it was all just a strange coincidence. Maybe the guy had somehow flagged down another driver right after I left. Maybe he wasn't as eerie as he seemed in the dark, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It started small. I'd get the sense that I wasn't alone when walking to my car, or I'd hear faint noises outside my house at night. At first, I told myself I was just being paranoid. My mind played tricks on me because of the encounter, but then the incidents got harder to explain. One night, about a week after the drive, I was getting ready for bed when I heard what sounded like tapping on the living room window. It was faint, irregular, but distinct enough to catch my attention. My heart sank. I turned off the lights and crept toward the window, peeking through the curtains. Nothing, just the empty street outside. I tried to laugh it off and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my front door rattling as if someone was trying to turn the knob. My chest tightened. I grabbed my phone and stayed perfectly still, listening. The rattling stopped, but I swear I could hear faint breathing on the other side of the door. I called the police. When they arrived, they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They told me it was probably a prank or my imagination, but I knew better. The next morning, I noticed something chilling. My car, parked in the driveway, had a smear of dirt on the driver's side window, like someone had pressed their hand against it. There were also faint streaks, as if they had been peering inside. I felt sick. I decided to stay at a friend's place for a few nights. While I was gone, I set up a cheap security camera pointed at my front door. When I reviewed the footage after returning, my worst fears were confirmed. At around 2:30 a.m., the camera caught a figure standing in my driveway. It was blurry and dark, but I recognized the posture, the way his head tilted slightly to the side. It was him. He stood there for what felt like hours, motionless, staring at my front door. Then, just before dawn, he walked away and disappeared down the street. I called the police again, showing them the footage. They took it more seriously this time, but they still didn't have much to go on. I changed my locks, installed more cameras, and even started parking my car in the garage. The visit stopped after that. Weeks passed, then months, and I began to feel normal again. But every so often, I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that I've heard that faint tapping on the window again. Life eventually settled down, but the unease never fully left me. Even though the visits seemed to have stopped, I became hypervigilant. I'd double check every lock, glance over my shoulder when walking to my car, and take alternate routes home just in case. My friends thought I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the paranoia. About 6 months after the initial encounter, I was finally starting to relax. I convinced myself it was over, that whoever that man was, he had moved on. I even began going out more, trying to reclaim my life. One night, I stayed late at a friend's house for a game night. It was fun, almost enough to make me forget everything, but as I was driving home, that familiar unease crept in. The road was eerily similar to the one where I'd first seen him, dark, quiet, lined with trees. My heart started racing, and I couldn't stop glancing in my rearview mirror. At first, it was empty, but then, about 10 minutes from home, headlights appeared in the distance behind me. They seemed harmless at first, just another car heading the same direction. But as I drove, they stayed uncomfortably close, matching my speed no matter how fast or slow I went. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. But when I turned onto my street, the car followed. My stomach dropped. I slowed down, hoping they'd pass me, but they didn't. Instead, they kept their distance, trailing just far enough behind to stay in the shadows. I didn't pull into my driveway. Instead, I kept driving, looping around the block. The car followed every turn I made. That's when I knew I was being hunted. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I didn't want to lead them to my house, but I also didn't want to stop somewhere isolated. Finally, I remembered there was a 24-hour gas station a few miles away. I drove there, pulling into the brightly lit parking lot and parking right next to the entrance. The car didn't follow me in. Instead, it idled on the street for a moment before speeding off into the night. I sat there for a while, trying to calm my shaking hands. When I finally felt steady enough to drive, I asked the gas station attendant to watch me leave. He agreed, standing at the door as I drove off. I took the long way home, circling a few extra blocks just to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I finally got home, I parked in the garage and locked every door and window. For the next few nights, I barely slept, jumping at every noise. Then, one morning, I found something that sent chills down my spine. On my front porch was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. Written on it in shaky handwriting were 3 words, "I'll be back." I called the police again, but once again, there was little they could do. They suggested I install more cameras and maybe even get a security system. I did everything they recommended and even considered moving, but I couldn't afford to. It's been years since then, and I've never seen him again. But the fear never fully goes away. Every time I walk to my car or hear a noise at night, I wonder if he's out there, waiting, watching. I don't know why he targeted me or what he wanted, but I pray I'll never find out. It was a dingy little place in an older building, but it was cheap, and I was just starting out. The layout was basic, a long hallway with several apartments on each side, ending in a fire exit that opened onto the alley below. Most of my neighbors were quiet, and I didn't see them often, but there was one man who stood out. He lived at the very end of the hall, in the apartment next to the fire exit. I never learned his name, but I always called him the man at the end of the hall in my head. He was, I passed him in the hallway, and he'd just stare at me without saying a word. Not a polite nod, not a smile, just this unnervingly blank expression. He was tall and thin, with sunken cheeks and greasy black hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. Something about him felt off, but I tried to brush it off. He never actually did anything, so I figured he was just socially awkward or maybe going through a rough time. Then things started getting weird. It began with small, almost imperceptible things. I'd come home to find my apartment door unlocked when I was sure I had locked it. I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway late at night, even though most of my neighbors were older and went to bed early. Once, I swore I heard someone trying my door handle, but when I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. One night, I came home late after a shift at work. The hallway lights were dim. One of the bulbs had burned out near the fire exit, leaving the end of the hall in shadows. As I walked toward my door, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, and there he was, the man at the end of the hall. He was standing in the shadows, staring at me, but this time, he had a faint smile on his face. It wasn't friendly, it was predatory. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He just kept staring, that unsettling smile never leaving his face. My skin crawled, and I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep well that night, or the night after. Something about the way he looked at me stuck in my mind, like a splinter I couldn't remove. I started avoiding him, timing my comings and goings so I wouldn't run into him. But one night, everything came to a head. It was around 2 a.m., and I was woken up by a noise, a faint scraping sound, like metal on wood. I froze, straining to hear. It was coming from the hallway, right outside outside my door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. He was there. The man at the end of the hall was crouched down, fiddling with my door handle. In his hand was what looked like a screwdriver or some kind of tool. He was trying to break in. I backed away, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone and called the police. I whispered to the operator, explaining the situation as quietly as I could. The scraping stopped, and for a horrifying moment, I thought he might have heard me. But when I looked through the peephole again, he was gone. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, but it felt like hours. They searched the building and the alley, but they didn't find him. However, they did find evidence that he'd been tampering with my door lock. They advised me to stay somewhere else for the night, and I didn't argue. The next morning, I went to the building manager and told him everything. He was shocked but promised to look into it. A few days later, I learned that the man at the end of the hall had been evicted. Apparently, he hadn't been paying rent, and when they went to inspect his apartment, they found it completely trashed. Holes in the walls, piles of garbage, and photos of me. There were pictures of me walking to my car, checking my mail, even sitting in my apartment, taken through the gap in my curtains. I moved out immediately and never looked back. After I moved out, I tried my best to put it all behind me, but it wasn't easy. For weeks, I felt like I was being watched, even in my new apartment. I double-checked all my locks, kept the curtains tightly closed, and installed a security camera by my front door. My friends told me I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. A few months went by without incident, and I started to relax. Maybe he really was just some creepy loner who fixated on me for a while. Maybe it was over. I wanted to believe that. Then one night, I found a package on my doorstep. It didn't have a return address, just my name written in messy, almost childlike handwriting. My stomach dropped. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at it, my instincts screaming at me not to touch it. But curiosity got the better of me, and I brought it inside. I opened the box carefully, half expecting something horrible to jump out. Inside was a single item, a photograph. It was me, taken recently at my new apartment. I was walking out the front door, completely unaware. Written on the back, in the same messy handwriting, were the words, "I found you." I called the police immediately, but there wasn't much they could do. Without any concrete evidence of who sent it, they couldn't make an arrest. I showed them the photo and explained everything, but all they could do was file a report and tell me to be careful. Terrified, I installed more security cameras, got pepper spray, and even started taking self-defense classes. But the worst part was the waiting. Every time I left my apartment, I was constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to be there. Every time I heard a noise outside, I thought he was coming for me. Late one night, it happened. I was in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps outside my window. My heart sank. My new apartment was on the second floor, so there shouldn't have been anyone out there. I grabbed my phone and crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. There he was. The man from the end of the hall was standing on the fire escape, staring directly at me. He had that same twisted smile on his face, like he was enjoying my fear. In his hand, he held something shiny, a knife. I didn't hesitate. I called the police, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone. I told the dispatcher what was happening and that I was alone. The operator stayed on the line with me, telling me to stay calm and that help was on the way. But then I heard it, the sound of the window latch being jiggled. He was trying to get in. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and stood by the door, ready to defend myself if he broke through. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I could hear him muttering to himself, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, and he bolted. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. This time, they took me seriously. They combed the area, but once again, they didn't find him. The officers stayed with me while I packed a bag, and I went to stay with a friend for a while. I couldn't bear to be alone. Eventually, I moved again, this time to a different city, and I've done everything I can to stay off the radar. No social media, no forwarding address, nothing that could lead him to me. I still don't know how he found me after I moved the first time, but I can't let my guard down. Even after moving to a new city and going completely off-grid, I couldn't shake the lingering fear. I was hyper aware of every little thing, footsteps behind me on a quiet street, an unfamiliar car parked outside, even just a wrong number call. I kept telling myself that I was safe now, but my nerves refused to believe it. Months turned into a year, and nothing happened. No mysterious packages, no unnerving encounters, nothing. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life. I found a new job, made a few friends, and even started seeing a therapist to work through the trauma. For the first time in a long while, I felt normal again. Until last week. It was a Friday night, and I had plans to meet some friends for dinner. As I was leaving my apartment, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was just a flyer or some junk, but when I pulled it out, my stomach dropped. It was a note. "You look happy. I'm glad you're settling in. No name, no signature signature, just that chilling message. My hands started shaking, and I immediately scanned the area, looking for anyone who might be watching me. The parking lot was mostly empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I canceled my plans and went straight to the police. They were sympathetic, but said there wasn't much they could do without a clear threat or evidence of who had left the note. They advised me to stay vigilant and report any further incidents. That night, I barely slept. I stayed up with every light in my apartment on, clutching the baseball bat I kept under my bed. Every little creak or sound outside sent me into a panic, but the night passed without incident. The next morning, I decided to review the footage from the security cameras I had installed around my apartment. Most of the recordings showed nothing unusual, just the occasional neighbor walking by our cars pulling in and out. But then, around 3 a.m., I saw the man from the end of the hall. He was standing just outside the range of one of the cameras, barely visible in the shadows. He must have known about the cameras because he never stepped fully into view, but I recognized his silhouette, the leggy frame, the hunched posture. He stood there for what felt like hours, just watching my apartment. At one point, he leaned forward as if trying to get a better look, then slipped away into the darkness. I felt sick. He had found me again. I packed a bag that same day and left town. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I rented a room in a small motel several towns away and started looking for another place to live. I've done this enough times now that it feels almost routine. Find a new apartment, change all my contact information, install more cameras, and pray that he doesn't find me again. I don't know how he keeps tracking me down. I've considered everything. He could be hacking into my information somehow, following me without my knowledge, or maybe it's something even more sinister. All I know is that I can't let my guard down, not for a second. So, to the man at the end of the hall, I don't know why you're doing this. I don't know what you want or how you keep finding me, but I know one thing. I've always been pretty independent, so the idea of staying alone in an Arab bit of quiet village in France didn't faze me. Looking back now, I wish I had been a little more cautious. The Arab was an old cottage on the outskirts of town. It was charming, with creaky wooden floors and ivy climbing up the walls. The host, Sylvie, messaged me beforehand, letting me know she wouldn't be there to greet me, but had left the key in a lockbox by the door. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was setting. After finding the key and settling in, I made myself some tea and curled up with a book. It was incredibly peaceful until it wasn't. Around 10 p.m., I heard what sounded like footsteps outside the cottage. At first, I brushed it off as a stray animal or maybe a neighbor passing by, but then I heard the distinct sound of the front door handle rattling. My stomach dropped. I froze, clutching my phone, debating whether to call someone or check it out myself. After what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. I peeked through the curtains but couldn't see anyone. Trying to shake off the nerves, I convinced myself it was nothing and went to bed. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a creak. Not just any creak, the kind that comes from old wooden floors inside the house. I didn't dare move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was inside could probably hear it. I strained to listen, and that's when I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps. Grabbing my phone, I dialed the emergency number for France but couldn't bring myself to hit call. I didn't know if I was overreacting, and the idea of a language barrier made me hesitate. Instead, I texted Sylvie to ask if anyone else had access to the house. No reply. The footsteps got closer, heading toward the room I was in. I quietly slid out of bed, grabbed my small pocket knife, and positioned myself behind the door. My mind raced with every worst case scenario. The doorknob turned. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "I'm calling the police," and lunged toward the door. Whomever it was bolted. I heard their footsteps thundering down the stairs and the front door slamming shut. Still shaking, I locked myself in the bedroom and actually called the police this time. They arrived about 30 minutes later, but whoever had been there was long gone. They found the lockbox outside open and the spare key missing. The weirdest part, when Sylvie finally got back to me, she told me she had no idea who it could have been. She didn't have any cleaners or maintenance scheduled, and the lockbox had been intact when she checked it earlier that week. Needless to say, I cut my trip short and left the next morning. I've stayed in plenty of Arabs since, but I always double check every lock, and I've never gone back to that cottage. After returning home, I tried to put the whole experience behind me. I told a few close friends and family members who all had the same reaction, shock, followed by concern for my safety. Most chalked it up to some random thief or drifter who saw an opportunity, but the whole situation didn't sit right with me. A few weeks later, I received a message from Ambient. They were following up on my stay at Sylvie's property, which I had reported after the incident. To my surprise, they informed me that another guest had experienced something similar, someone attempting to enter the cottage during the night. The guest had also left early and filed a complaint, which led Ambient to investigate. The revelation was chilling. This wasn't a one-off, and it likely wasn't random. random. I reached out to Sylvie again, hoping to get more details. This time, she seemed a little more forthcoming. She admitted that, a few months before my stay, she'd had issues with her ex-partner. He was controlling and refused to accept their breakup. She claimed he had shown up uninvited at the cottage before but assured me she thought the situation was under control. Under control, the spare key had gone missing and someone had been creeping around her property at night. It seemed like she was trying to downplay everything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. I pushed Arab for more information, but privacy policies kept them from sharing specifics about the other guests' experience. All they would say was that the listing had been removed while they conducted their investigation. I was left with more questions than answers. Was it Sylvie's ex, someone who had stayed there before and copied the key, or was it a local who knew the property well? Whatever the case, I'm just grateful I listened to my instincts that night. Even now, I occasionally wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I've heard someone creeping around. It's a fear that stays with you, that little voice whispering, what if? Months passed, and life moved on, but the experience stayed with me. Occasionally, I'd find myself googling Sylvie's village, checking the news for anything suspicious or related to break-ins or arrests. Nothing ever came up. It was as if the whole thing had been a bad dream. But then, one day, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line simply read, about the cottage. My stomach twisted as I opened it. The email was brief. I'm sorry about what happened. I didn't mean to scare you. I was looking for Sylvie. She didn't tell me someone else was staying there. I'll leave you alone now. No name, no details, and no way to reply. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Was it Sylvie's ex? Someone else? And how had they gotten my email? Arab is supposed to keep that information private. Did Sylvie give it to them? Or had they found another way to track me down? I forwarded the email to Arab immediately, demanding an explanation. Their response was polite but unhelpful. They assured me their systems were secure and suggested I change my email password just in case. They also reiterated that Sylvie's listing had been permanently removed. That night, as I tried to fall asleep, my mind replayed every detail of the email. I didn't mean to scare you. It was such a strange choice of words. If they didn't mean to scare me, why creep around the house in the middle of the night? Why try the doorknob? None of it made sense. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. In the timestamp of the email, the sender had used a different time zone. A small clue, but enough to suggest they were still in Europe. That ruled out a random hacker or scammer. This was personal. I blocked the sender and changed every password I could think of. I even contacted the police in France, forwarding them the email and recounting the story in detail. They were sympathetic but said there wasn't much they could do unless the person made direct contact again. Weeks passed and nothing else happened. But then, late one night, I got another email. This time, it was just a single line. You're safe now. No context, no explanation. It didn't make me feel safe at all. Since then, I've done my best to let it go, but I can't help but wonder, was it really Sylvie's ex? Was it someone else entirely? And what did they mean by you're safe now? Had something happened to them or to Sylvie? I never heard from her again, and the cottage seems to have disappeared entirely from rental sites. So, to the person who sent those cryptic emails, I hope you really have moved on. And to Sylvie, wherever you are, I hope you're okay. But to whoever was behind that door, to whoever thought it was okay to terrify a stranger in the middle of the night, let's absolutely never meet. I'm a 24-year-old woman, and at the time, I was working the evening shift at a coffee shop. My shift ended around 11 p.m., and because the shop was in a quieter part of town, the parking lot was usually empty by then. That night started like any other. I finished up, locked the doors, and walked out to my car, which was parked near the edge of the lot, close to the tree line. It was one of those nights where the air felt heavier than usual, but I didn't think much of it. I was just eager to get home. As I got closer to my car, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. A man was standing about 10 feet away from it. Just staring. He wasn't moving or saying anything, just standing there with his hands in his pockets, facing me. He looked like he was in his late 40s, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans. I hesitated, thinking maybe he was just lost or waiting for someone, but something about him felt off. I cleared my throat and tried to sound casual. Oh, can I help you? He didn't respond. His face was partially in shadow, but I could see enough to know he was smiling, this weird, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. Now I was getting nervous. My car was the only one left in the lot, so it was obvious I was alone. I decided to play it safe. I turned around and started walking back toward the coffee shop. That's when I heard him speak, and his voice made my skin crawl. You forgot something. I stopped but didn't turn around. My keys were in my hand. My bag was slung over my shoulder. What could I have forgotten? Before I could respond, he added, "Come here. I'll show you." Nope, absolutely not. At this point, every instinct in me was screaming to get out of there. I picked up my pace and made it back to the shop door. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the key, messy, but I managed to get inside and lock the door behind me. Through the glass, I saw him still standing there, but now he was closer to my car. He was holding something in his hand. I couldn't tell what it was, but he waved it at me like he was trying to taunt me. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the tree line. I stayed in the shop for another 20 minutes, calling a friend to come pick me up. When they arrived, we checked around my car together. There was nothing unusual, except for a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. It just said, "See you soon," in messy, scrawled handwriting. After that night, my anxiety went into overdrive. I'd been independent for years, but suddenly I couldn't bring myself to go anywhere alone, especially at night. The sight of any man loitering around made my heart race. My friends and family tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just some weirdo trying to scare me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. About 2 weeks after the parking lot incident, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. First, it was a car, a beat-up, dark sedan that I kept seeing parked near the coffee shop when I arrived from my shifts. It wasn't in the customer lot, but rather across the street, facing the building. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing, but then I started noticing it at other places too, near my gym, on the street by my apartment, even outside my grocery store. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Plenty of people have old sedans, right? But then came the second thing. One night, as I was locking up the shop, I found another note. This time, it wasn't on my car but taped to the back door of the building. It was the same messy handwriting as before, but this time it said, "Miss me." My blood ran cold. I didn't tell my coworkers because I didn't want to freak them out, but I did call the police again. They sent an officer out, but once again, there wasn't much they could do without a suspect or tangible threat. A few days later, I came home from work and found my apartment door unlocked. I froze. I was 100% sure I had locked it when I left that morning. My heart was pounding as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Nothing looked out of place at first, but then I saw it, a single red rose on my kitchen counter. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just some random creep trying to scare me. He had been inside my home. He knew where I lived. I called the police again, and this time, they took it more seriously. They checked for signs of forced entry but didn't find any. They suggested that maybe I had left the door unlocked, but I knew I hadn't. I started staying with a friend after that because there was no way I was sleeping in that apartment alone. The scariest part, the notes didn't stop. Every few days, I'd find one in places I couldn't explain, slipped into my locker at work, tucked under my windshield wiper, even inside my gym bag. Each one was more unsettling than the last. One just said, "Soon." I eventually decided to move. I couldn't handle the constant fear anymore, and the police weren't offering much help. I changed jobs, switched apartments, and even got a new car to try and break the pattern. For a while, it worked. I didn't see the dark sedan again, and the notes stopped coming. But then, a few months ago, I got a text from an unknown number. It just said, "You look good in red." I had been wearing a red sweater that day. After that text, I felt my entire body lock up with fear. I sat on my couch for hours, staring at my phone and trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was just some random spam message or a cruel coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't respond to the text, but I forwarded it to the police. They assured me they would look into it, but given how little they'd been able to do in the past, I didn't have high hopes. I changed my phone number the next day, but the damage was already done. I knew he had found me again, and no number or lock or distance was going to stop him. A week later, I was at home, trying to relax and put it out of my mind. I had all the curtains drawn and the doors triple checked. I was watching TV when I heard a faint sound outside, a soft tapping, almost rhythmic, like something brushing against the window. My heart dropped. I froze, listening intently. The tapping stopped, and for a few moments, everything was silent. Then came a new sound, a faint scratching, like nails dragging along the glass. I wanted to believe it was just the wind or maybe a tree branch, but I couldn't convince myself. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the nearest window. Slowly, I lifted the corner of the curtain and peeked outside. There, in the glow of the porch light, was a man. He was standing just a few feet from my window, his face partially obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt, but I could see his smile, that same tight-lipped, unsettling grin that haunted my dreams. In his hand was a single red rose. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone as I dialed 911. When the operator picked up, I could barely form a coherent sentence. I managed to tell them there was a man outside my window and begged them to send someone immediately. When I dared to look out again, he was gone, just vanished, like he had never been there. But on the window pane, scrawled in something dark and wet, were 3 words, "See you soon." The police arrived within minutes, but as always, they found nothing. No footprints, no rose, no trace of the man who had been there just moments before. They told told me it could have been a prank, maybe some kids messing around, but I knew better. It was him. After that, I couldn't stay in that house. I packed up and moved in with a friend, explaining only that I was dealing with a stalker. They were understanding and let me crash in their guest room while I tried to figure out what to do next. But the scariest part of all this, even though I haven't seen him again since that night, I still feel like I'm being watched. Sometimes, I'll catch a glimpse of a dark sedan in my rearview mirror, or I'll feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I'm walking alone. I used to work at an amusement park. It wasn't one of those sprawling theme parks, but a local one with a mix of old, creaky rides and a few newer attractions. I was part of the maintenance team, working the night shift. My job was to inspect and repair the rides after the park closed. The incident happened about a year ago, but I still think about it every time I see a carnival or a Ferris wheel. That night, my supervisor told me to check out the water ride. It was one of those log flume rides with a fake mountain built around it. Guests would ride through dark tunnels, passing animatronic animals, before plunging down a steep drop into a splash pool. One of the animatronics wasn't functioning right. It was a bear that would pop out of the wall in one of the dark tunnels. Simple enough. I grabbed my tools and headed to the maintenance entrance at the back of the ride. The maintenance area was nothing like the fun, brightly lit part of the park. It was dark, cold, and smelled like stagnant water and grease. There were narrow walkways alongside the ride track and several access tunnels that twisted and turned through the structure. I climbed down a ladder into the tunnel where the bear was supposed to be. The lights down there were dim, and the only sound was the occasional drip of water echoing through the space. I found the animatronic. It looked fine on the surface, but when I opened the access panel, I saw that some of the wiring had been ripped apart, almost like something had clawed at it. I figured maybe a rat or raccoon had gotten in. That wasn't unusual, but as I worked to replace the wiring, I felt a strange prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but the tunnel behind me was empty. I shook it off and kept working. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It sounded almost like an animal, but not quite. It was too deep, too guttural. My chest tightened, and I froze. Slowly, I turned toward the direction of the sound, shining my flashlight down the tunnel. The beam caught something moving, something big. It ducked out of sight behind a corner, but not before I got a glimpse. It wasn't a raccoon or a rat. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were reflective, glowing faintly in the flashlight beam like a predator's in the dark. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I scrambled back up the ladder as fast as I could, nearly slipping in my panic. As I reached the top, I slammed the access hatch shut and bolted it. I told my supervisor about what I saw, but he laughed it off, saying I must have imagined it. Maybe I would have believed him if it weren't for the scratches I saw the next day, long, deep gouges in the metal ladder and the walls of the tunnel. I quit that job not long after. The rumors about the ride didn't stop after I left, and they only got weirder. A few weeks after I quit, I got a message from one of my old coworkers, Aaron. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, not prone to making up stories or exaggerating. The text read, "Did you see this? The log ride is closed again. Manager's not saying why. Heard something happened to the new guy. He bolted mid-shift and hasn't come back. Something freaked him out. Thought you'd want to know." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the thing I saw in the tunnel, its glowing eyes, its skeletal frame. I tried telling myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But Aaron's text had shaken me. Someone else had clearly seen or experienced something down there. Curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I texted Aaron back and asked if he wanted to grab a beer. If anyone had the guts to poke around and figure out what was going on, it was him. We met up later that night at a dive bar not far from the park. Aaron looked rough, like he hadn't been sleeping much either. He leaned in close as we talked, keeping his voice low like he was afraid someone might overhear. "You remember that night you quit?" he asked. "The tunnel." I nodded. I didn't imagine it, Aaron. There was something down there. He exhaled sharply. "I know. I saw it too." Aaron told me that after I left, the animatronic repairs kept needing to be redone. Wiring ripped apart, panels smashed in. But it wasn't just the bear. Other parts of the ride were being wrecked in ways that didn't make sense, like something or someone was systematically tearing it apart from the inside. Then he dropped a bombshell. We got access to the old blueprints of the ride. The tunnels are bigger than we thought. There are sections that don't show up on the current plans, like hidden passages, and they go deep, way below the park's foundations. Way deeper than that database. I stared at him, my stomach nodding. Why would they build something like that? Aaron shook his head. No clue. But some of those passages look ancient, like they were there before the park was built. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. "Have you been down there?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Once. We didn't go far. The deeper you go, the worse it gets. The air feels heavy, like it's hard to breathe. And it's not just the smell, it's this feeling like you shouldn't be there." I didn't ask him him what he meant by worse. I didn't want to know, but then he said something that made my blood run cold. The thing you saw, I think it's not alone. Aaron went on to explain that he'd heard strange noises in the tunnels, scraping, whispering, and what sounded like muffled laughter. He said a few workers claimed to have seen shapes moving in the shadows, but no one stuck around long enough to confirm it. After that night, Aaron and I made a pact we'd stay out of it. Whatever was down there, it wasn't our problem anymore, but the park didn't let it go. A month later, I heard they'd shut down the log ride permanently, claiming it wasn't worth the cost of repairs. They fenced off the area and started dismantling parts of the mountain, but I never heard if they finished. A few months after that, the park closed for good. Officially, it was due to declining attendance, but locals whispered that something else had happened. There were rumors of workers disappearing, strange accidents, and management refusing to answer questions. I've stayed away from the site ever since, but sometimes I can't help but wonder, did they bury whatever was down there, or did they just leave it behind, waiting for someone else to stumble across it? About a year after the park closed, I was scrolling through my phone one night when I came across a local urban exploration forum. I wasn't a part of that scene, but the title of one thread stopped me cold. Exploring the abandoned log ride at Pinecrest Amusement Park. Weird stuff found. The post was filled with grainy photos taken inside the dismantled log flume ride. Most of it was what you'd expect: graffiti-covered walls, rusted metal, and broken animatronics. But as I scrolled further, my unease grew. One photo showed what looked like claw marks etched deep into the concrete walls of the tunnel. Another showed a gaping hole on the floor, leading to a dark, seemingly endless drop. Then I got to the last photo. It was blurry, clearly taken in a panic, but the caption read, "Not sure what this was, but it was moving." The image showed a pale, humanoid figure crouched in the shadows. Its elongated limbs were unmistakable, as were its glowing, reflective eyes. The thread blew up with comments. Some people joked it was just a prank or a homeless person squatting in the tunnels. Others suggested it might be some kind of mutated animal. A few, though, were dead serious, claiming the tunnels were cursed or that something supernatural had been unleashed when the park was built. What really got to me, though, were the comments from people claiming to have worked at the park. One wrote, "This isn't the first time someone's seen that thing. Maintenance workers used to talk about it all the time, but management always told us to keep quiet." Another said, "I worked on that ride too. We always thought there was something wrong with the place. The lights would go out for no reason, and sometimes we'd hear voices when no one else was around. I'm not surprised it shut down." The thread stuck with me for days. I thought about reaching out to the poster, warning them not to go back, but I didn't. Maybe I was too scared they'd ask me for details I wasn't ready to revisit, or maybe I just didn't want to get involved again. About 2 weeks later, I saw another post on the same forum. This one was titled, "Urban Explorer Missing After Visit to Pinecrest Amusement Park." The post was a news article about a young man who disappeared after telling friends he planned to explore the old park. His car was found parked near the entrance, but there was no sign of him. Search teams combed the area but found nothing, no footprints, no clues, no trace of him at all. The forums exploded with speculation. Some people said he'd probably fallen into one of the holes in the tunnels and gotten stuck. Others thought he might have gotten lost in the underground passages and died of dehydration. But there were a few who hinted at something darker. One commenter wrote, "The park was built on cursed land. They say something was already there, buried deep, and the rides disturbed it. That's why they closed it down. Whatever they awakened, it doesn't like visitors." That comment stuck with me. It made me wonder if the thing I saw, and whatever else might have been down there, wasn't just some random anomaly. What if it had been waiting, dormant, until the park was built? What if tearing the rides down only made it angrier? I've stayed away from Pinecrest, but every now and then, I'll hear a story. The hiker will claim they saw strange lights near the old ride, or someone will report hearing screams echoing through the empty park. Most people dismiss it as urban legend or kids playing pranks, but I know better. I can't stop thinking about that last photo in the forum thread. The thing wasn't just hiding, it was watching, and the way it crouched, the way its glowing eyes stared straight into the camera lens. It wasn't scared, it was waiting. A few months ago, I was driving back from a wedding when my GPS rerouted me onto a smaller road. I wasn't in a hurry, so I decided to follow it. The route cut through some forested area, and after about 20 minutes, I passed a faded sign that read Maplewood Amusement Park. Closed for renovation. I'd never heard of it before, but something about the sign intrigued me. I've always loved theme parks, even run-down ones. Figuring I had time to kill, I decided to stop and take a look. The entrance gate was rusted, with vines creeping up its frame. Beyond it, the park looked almost frozen in time. Colorful signs faded by the sun, a carousel missing half its horses, and a Ferris wheel standing still against the gray sky. There was a strange quiet, like the world outside had been muted. As I wandered deeper into the park, I saw a roller coaster called the Thunder thunderbolts. The track twisted wildly, its metal frame groaning in the wind. At the base of the ride, there was a small operator's booth, the glass cloudy with dirt. Furious, I peered inside. To my shock, there was someone in the booth. An older man sat hunched over the controls, wearing a faded uniform. His name tag was missing, and his hat obscured most of his face. Before I could say anything, he looked up, his eyes, watery and pale, locked onto mine. "You here for the ride?" he asked. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't used it in years. I laughed nervously. No, I was just exploring. The park's been closed for a while, right?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and motioned to the roller coaster's car, which was sitting on the track like it was waiting for me. "It's already best seat in the house." Something about his tone sent a shiver down my spine. I stammered an excuse about needing to leave, but he stepped out of the booth, blocking my path. His movements were jerky, unnatural. "You came all this way," he said, his grin revealing yellow teeth. "One ride would hurt." Against my better judgment, I climbed into the car. I thought maybe humoring him would make him let me go. As soon as I sat down, the safety bar slammed down on its own, trapping me in place. "Enjoy the ride," the operator croaked. His grin widened as he pulled the lever. The car lurched forward, and the ride began. At first, it was slow, the track creaking beneath me. But as we climbed the first hill, I noticed something odd. The sky darkened unnaturally fast, and the trees around the park blurred together. I swear I heard whispers, low, guttural voices, coming from the shadows. When the car reached the peak, it paused. Below, the park is gone. Instead, there was nothing, just a swirling black void. Then, the car dropped. I can't explain what happened next. It felt like I was falling forever, the voices growing louder and more frantic. Shadows reached out from the void, clawing at the car. The air was freezing, and I could barely breathe. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the car screeched to a stop. I was back at the platform. The operator was gone. The booth was empty, and the ride looked like it hadn't run in decades. The safety bar lifted, and I stumbled out, shaking. I didn't stick around to investigate. I ran back to my car and drove until I hit a main road. When I checked the GPS, the route to the amusement park had vanished. There was no record of Maplewood Amusement Park anywhere online. A week later, I started having nightmares. At first, they were vague flashes, dark tunnels, twisting tracks, and that void I saw beneath the roller coaster. But they kept getting worse. In one dream, I was back in the car, and the operator's face hovered inches from mine, his pale eyes glowing in the dark. "You never really left," he whispered. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. One morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, who might know about Maplewood Amusement Park. I posted on a local history forum, asking if anyone remembered it. Most replies were dead ends, people saying they'd never heard of it. But the one comment caught my attention. Maplewood. That place burned down in the 80 seconds. Freak accident on the thunderbolts. They shut the whole park down after that. I felt a chill run through me. Burned out. The park didn't look new, but it certainly wasn't a pile of ashes when I was there. I replied, asking for more details, and the user sent me a link to an old news article. The headline read, "Fatal fire claims 8 lives at local amusement park." My stomach turned as I skimmed the article. According to the report, the fire started during an after-hours test of the roller coaster. The ride operator had stayed late that night to run maintenance. When the fire broke out, it spread so fast that the operator and a group of teenagers who had snuck in after dark didn't stand a chance. Their bodies were never recovered. There was a grainy black and white photo of the operator in the article. It was hard to make out, but the uniform and hat were unmistakable. My blood ran cold. It was him. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe I had somehow imagined the whole thing. But as I stared at the screen, something strange happened. The photo flickered for a moment, like an old TV screen losing signal. And then, I swear the operator looked directly at me. His lips curled into that same unnerving grin. I slammed my laptop shut and tried to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next few days, little things started happening. I'd hear faint creaking sounds at night, like the groan of metal. The scent of burnt wood and singed hair would waft through my apartment out of nowhere. And the whispers. God, the whispers. They followed me everywhere, just low enough that I couldn't make out the words. The final straw came 2 nights ago. I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I never sleep with it open. When I sat up, I saw something on my dresser that hadn't been there before. It was a ticket. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the name was clear as day, Maplewood Amusement Park. Below that, in looping cursive, it read, "Admit one." I threw it in the trash, but the next morning, it was back on my dresser. Only this time, there was a date and time scrawled across the back. Tonight, midnight. I'm writing this now because I don't know what's going to happen when the clock strikes 12. The whispers have been getting louder, and every time I close my eyes, I see the roller coaster again, twisting into the void. I spent the day pacing my apartment, trying to convince myself not to go. I even thought about calling a friend, but what could I say? "Hey, I think a ghost roller roller coaster is stalking me, can you help? No one would believe me. I barely believed it myself. As midnight approached, the air in my apartment grew heavy, the temperature dropped sharply, and the whispers turned into a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through my skull. When my phone chimed with an alert, I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was a calendar reminder I'd never set. Your ride departs in 30 minutes. Don't be late. I tried ignoring it, but the hum grew louder. My walls started creaking, the sound eerily similar to the groan of the roller coaster tracks. Then, a faint melody floated through the air, the tinny, warped sound of a calliope. I couldn't breathe. It was the same music I'd heard at the park, playing from the broken carousel. Before I knew it, I was grabbing my car keys. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was like my body was moving on its own, a puppet to some unseen force. The ticket was still on my dresser, and against all logic, I slipped it into my pocket. The drive was a blur. My headlights barely cut through the oppressive darkness, and the GPS, which I hadn't even programmed, displayed a route to the park. My hands gripped the wheels so tightly they ached. I wanted to turn back, but my body refused to obey. When I arrived, the park looked even more decrepit than before. The gate was wide open, and the flickering glow of old string lights cast eerie shadows. The calliope music was louder now, distorted and discordant, like it was being played underwater. I stepped through the gate, and the air immediately felt thicker, heavier. The ticket burned in my pocket as I made my way to the Thunderbolt. It stood there, its skeletal frame looming against the night sky, lit by a strange, pale glow. The operator was waiting for me, right on time. He said, his grin as unsettling as ever. His uniform looked cleaner this time, almost new, and the faded hat now bore a pristine Maplewood logo. I don't want to do this, I said, my voice trembling. Please, just let me leave. You can't leave, he replied, tilting his head. Not until you finish the ride. The roller coaster car sat on the track, gleaming like it had been freshly polished. Against my will, my legs carried me toward it. The operator tipped his hat as I climbed in, and the safety bar slammed down with a force that knocked the wind out of me. As the car lurched forward, the operator waved, "See you on the other side." This time, the ride was different. The world around me blurred into a swirling void as the car sped up, faster and faster. Shadows crawled along the edges of my vision, twisting into grotesque shapes. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices screaming in languages I couldn't understand. The car plummeted, and I felt like I was being torn apart. The shadows reached out, clawing at my skin, my soul, pulling me deeper into the void. Just when I thought I would lose myself completely, the car came to an abrupt stop. I was back on the platform, the operator was gone, and the park was silent. I stumbled out of the car, my legs weak, and realized something was wrong. The world felt the colors were muted, and the air was cold, heavy with the scent of burning wood. When I reached the gate, I saw my car, but it looked different. Older, dust covered, like it had been sitting there for decades. I climbed in, desperate to escape, but the keys wouldn't turn. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The operator was sitting in the back seat, his pale eyes glowing in the darkness. "You're part of the ride now," he whispered, his grin stretching impossibly wide. The last thing I remember was his laughter, echoing in my ears as everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting on a bench inside the park. The sun was rising, and everything looked crowded. Families were walking around, eating cotton candy and laughing. The park was alive, vibrant, as if nothing had ever happened. But when I tried to leave, I couldn't. Every path led me back to the Thunderbolt, and every time I saw it, the operator was there, tipping his hat and waiting. I've been here ever since. No one seems to notice me. No one answers when I scream. So, if you ever pass a sign for Maplewood Amusement Park, do yourself a favor, keep driving. Because once you're here, you're never leaving. It was late October, the kind of chilly evening where you could see your breath but not quite call it winter. I was driving home from my friend's house after a late night horror movie marathon. My route was mostly back roads, winding through a quiet stretch of forest. No streetlights, just the occasional reflective sign and the eerie glow of my headlights piercing through the dark. About halfway home, I saw something strange, a man standing on the side of the road. He was waving his arms frantically, trying to flag me down. He looked out of place, a large backpack slung over one shoulder, his clothes dirty and torn, and his face. Well, his face was pale, like he'd been out in the cold for hours. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. My mom's voice echoed in my head, "Don't pick up hitchhikers. You never know who you're dealing with." With something about this guy looked desperate, I reasoned that I could at least roll down my window and see if he needed help. I stopped the car a few feet ahead of him, keeping the engine running. He jogged up to my window, his breath visible in the cold air. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice shaking. "My car broke down a couple miles back. My phone's dead. bad, and I just need a ride to the nearest gas station. There was something off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted around like he was checking for something, or someone. I'm sorry, I said cautiously. I don't usually pick people up, but I can call someone for you if you want. His expression shifted in an instant. The polite desperation vanished, replaced by something harder to read. Anger, maybe. He leaned in closer to the window, and I instinctively locked the doors. Come on, he said, his voice lower now. I'm freezing out here. Just a quick ride. That's all I need. Alarm bells were ringing in my head. I shook my head and said, sorry, I can't, before putting the car in drive. As I started to pull away, he slammed his fist on the back window, shouting something I couldn't make out. My heart was racing as I sped down the road. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him running after me or another car following me, but the road stayed empty. About 10 minutes later, I reached a small gas station. Relieved, I pulled in and parked under the bright fluorescent lights. I was about to go inside to let the clerk know about the man when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Parked on the side of the lot, barely visible in the shadows, was a beat-up car, and leaning against it, staring directly at me, was the man I had just left on the side of the road. I didn't wait to find out how he'd gotten there or what he wanted. I backed out of the lot so fast my tires squealed and didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my driveway. I double-checked all my locks that night and slept with a kitchen knife under my pillow. The days after the encounter were uneasy, to say the least. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I rationalized it as paranoia. I double-checked my locks constantly, kept my curtains drawn, and made a habit of avoiding dark, isolated places. For a while, nothing unusual happened, and I started to convince myself it was just a creepy coincidence. But then, the note started. It began with a folded piece of paper left under my windshield wiper. I found it one morning as I was leaving for work. Written in smudged ink were 3 chilling words: you drive fast. My stomach dropped. I looked around, scanning the quiet suburban street, but saw no one. Trying to shake it off, I tossed the note and drove to work. Maybe it was a prank, I told myself, someone messing around. But then, it happened again. 2 days later, another note appeared, this time taped to my front door. It read, you shouldn't ignore people. My hands trembled as I held the paper, and my chest felt tight. This wasn't a prank. Someone knew where I lived. I called the police, but they weren't much help. Without a clear threat or evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested installing security cameras, which I did the very next day. I also told my closest friends about what was happening, and a couple of them offered to stay over for a few nights. For a while, the cameras and the extra company gave me a sense of security, but that didn't last long. One night, about a week after the second note, I woke up to the sound of a thud outside my bedroom window. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and quietly crept to the window. Peeking through the curtains, I couldn't see anything unusual, but I could feel someone or something out there. I opened the security app on my phone to check the camera feed. My blood ran cold. There he was, the man from the road. He was standing in my driveway, staring directly at the camera. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, but I recognized him immediately. He didn't move. He just stood there, as if he knew I was watching him. I called 911, whispering into the phone as I kept my eyes glued to the screen. It felt like hours before I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. The man finally moved, walking calmly out of view before the police arrived. They searched the area but found nothing. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. The officers assured me they'd patrol the area for the next few nights, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't think he'd come back. But he did. The final straw came 2 nights later. I was lying in bed, trying to calm my nerves, when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the security app, a new motion alert. I opened the app and nearly dropped my phone. The camera inside my living room, the one facing the front door, was recording. The door was slightly ajar, and standing just inside was the man. He looked directly at the camera, smiled, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then he stepped back and disappeared. I didn't wait to find out how he got in or what he wanted. I grabbed my keys, ran to my car, and drove straight to a friend's house. I never went back to that house alone. I filed a restraining order, hired a locksmith to change every lock, and eventually moved across the state. I don't know who he was or why he targeted me, but I still think about him sometimes. His pale face, his unnerving calm, the way he always seemed to be one step ahead. After I moved across the state, life slowly returned to normal. The fear that had consumed me began to fade, and I convinced myself that I was finally safe. The house I chose was in a busy neighborhood, with neighbors close close by in a well-lit street. I installed an upgraded security system, complete with cameras inside and out. I even adopted a dog, a scrappy mutt named Max who barked at the slightest noise. For the first time in months, I felt secure. That peace lasted about a year. One chilly autumn evening, I was walking Max around the block. It was a quiet night, the kind where you could hear leaves crunching underfoot and the distant hum of cars on the main road. As we rounded the corner back toward my house, Max suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. I looked around but didn't see anything. "Come on, boy," I said, tugging his leash gently, but he wouldn't budge. Instead, he turned his head toward a nearby street lamp, his growl growing louder. And then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the light, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure. They stood motionless, watching us. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the stance, the shape of the backpack slung over one shoulder. It was him. I didn't wait. I yanked Max's leash and ran back to the house, fumbling with my keys as I tried to unlock the door. Max barked wildly, his usual playful demeanor replaced by an almost feral aggression. I finally got the door open and slammed it shut behind me, locking it and every other lock in the house. My heart raced as I checked the camera feed. The front yard was empty. The street was empty. He was gone, as if he'd never been there. I called the police again, explaining the situation in shaky breaths. An officer arrived about 30 minutes later to take my statement and patrol the area. But just like before, there was no trace of him. The officer suggested it might have been someone passing through, maybe even a trick of the light. But I knew better. I spent the next few days on high alert, barely sleeping and jumping at every noise. My friends tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a coincidence or a case of mistaken identity. I wanted to believe them, but deep down, I knew it was him. Then came the final message. One morning, I opened my door to let Max out into the fenced backyard. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something sitting on the steps. It was a small, folded piece of paper. My hand shook as I picked it up and unfolded it. Scrawled in the same smudged handwriting as before were the words, "Did you misbehave?" I dropped the paper and ran inside, locking the door behind me. That was the moment I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my belongings, sold the house at a loss, and moved halfway across the country. This time, I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. To this day, I don't know how he found me or why he targeted me. I've changed my number, deleted all my social media, and live as anonymously as possible. Max is still with me, older now but just as loyal. Every so often, he'll bark at nothing, and I'll feel that same chill run down my spine. I don't know if he's still out there, watching, waiting. But to the man who has haunted my life for years, let's never meet again. A few years ago, I was driving across the Midwest on a long solo road trip. It was late October, and the weather had been unpredictable. 1 minute clear skies, the next, sudden bursts of rain. On this particular evening, I was on a lonely stretch of highway, surrounded by nothing but open fields and occasional clusters of trees. The sun was setting, painting the sky in ominous shades of red and orange. I was about an hour away from the next town when I saw him. A man, standing on the side of the road, his thumb out in the universal sign for "I need a ride." He looked rough, dirty clothes, a backpack slung over one shoulder, but not necessarily dangerous. I hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something I'd ever done, but the next town was a long way off, and it was getting cold. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. He jogged up to my car, flashing a tired but grateful smile. "Thanks," he said as he climbed into the passenger seat. His voice was gravelly, like he hadn't spoken in days. "I just need to get to the next town." I nodded and kept driving, trying to make small talk to ease the awkwardness. He wasn't much of a conversationalist, giving one-word answers or vague responses. Something about him felt off, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something strange. He kept glancing at the glove compartment, almost like he was trying to decide whether to open it. I tried to ignore it, but my unease grew with each passing mile. "Do you live around here?" I asked, hoping to distract him. "Not really," he said, his eyes still darting to the glove box. I was starting to regret my decision when he suddenly leaned forward and pointed to a small rest area coming up. "Can we stop there for a second?" he asked. "I need to use the bathroom." I agreed, more because I wanted a moment to collect myself than out of any concern for his needs. As soon as I pulled into the parking lot, he grabbed his backpack and got out. He didn't head for the bathroom, though. Instead, he walked around the side of the building and disappeared from view. I waited for a minute, then two, but he didn't come back. My gut was screaming at me to leave, so I decided to check his seat. When I leaned over, I noticed something sticking out of the side pocket of his backpack, which he left behind. It was a knife knife. My heart raced as I realized how close I'd come to potentially being in serious danger. Without thinking twice, I jumped back into the driver's seat and sped out of there, leaving him and his knife behind. About an hour later, I reached the next town and pulled into a gas station. I called the local sheriff to report what had happened, and they sent someone to meet me. After hearing my story, the deputy's face grew serious. We've had reports of a man matching that description attacking drivers on this stretch of highway. He said if you were lucky, he usually waits until they stop somewhere isolated. I never found out what happened to him, and honestly, I don't want to know. I just hope he never found another car to get into. A week after the incident, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every time I got into my car, I triple-checked the locks and scanned the backseat. My friends and family brushed it off, saying I was just rattled from the close call, but something about the whole experience stuck with me in a way I couldn't explain. Then came the phone call. It was a Friday night, and I was home alone, trying to distract myself with a movie. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I glanced at the screen. The number was blocked. Normally, I'd ignore calls like that, but for some reason, I felt compelled to answer. Hello, I said, my voice cautious. There was a pause. Then, a gravelly voice I instantly recognized. You left something of mine. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to find my words. Who is this? You know who? The voice replied. You took off with my bag. That wasn't very nice. I was shaking now. How did he find me? My number wasn't listed, and I hadn't given him any personal information. Leave me alone, I managed to say before hanging up. For the rest of the night, I sat in my living room with every light in the house turned on, jumping at every sound. I barely slept. The next morning, I went straight to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. Without a number or a name, they couldn't track him down. They suggested I change my locks, keep my phone number private, and stay alert. Over the next few days, things quieted down. No more calls, no strange encounters. I started to think maybe it was over. Then, one night, I came home to find a piece of paper taped to my front door. Written in messy, scrawled handwriting were the words, "You're lucky you drove off. Next time, you won't be." I felt the blood drain from my face as I looked around, but the street was empty. I tore the note down and called the police again, but once more, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to stay with a friend or family member for a while, which I did. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. Eventually, the calls and notes stopped, but I moved to a new city anyway, just to be safe. I don't know how he got my number or my address, but I don't want to think about what might have happened if I hadn't left the rest area when I did. Even now, years later, I still get nervous on long drives. I never stop for strangers, no matter how desperate they look. It's been years since I moved away, and life has finally started to feel normal again. I changed my name, cut ties with most of my social media, and stayed under the radar. No more long road trips, no more risky decisions. I thought I had left the nightmare behind, until last week. It started with something small, a feeling of being watched. I brushed it off at first. I told myself it was just residual paranoia from the past, but then I started noticing little things that didn't add up. A car parked across the street from my house for hours, the same car I'd seen near my work 2 days prior. A figure standing at the edge of the grocery store parking lot, just far enough away that I couldn't make out their face. And then the note. This time, it wasn't left on my door. It was slipped into the windshield wiper of my car while I was inside a coffee shop. I almost didn't notice it, but when I did, my stomach dropped. It was the same messy handwriting. You thought you could run, but I've always known where you are. I stood there in the parking lot, frozen, the note crumpled in my shaking hands. He had found me again. That night, I called the police, but the officer who came by seemed skeptical. It could be a prank. He said, do you have any enemies or exes who might want to scare you? I tried to explain the history, how this wasn't just someone messing with me, but without proof, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to patrol the neighborhood more frequently, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. Over the next few days, I felt like I was losing my mind. I started double bolting my doors, checking the windows every hour, jumping at every sound. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured him standing over my bed, knife in hand. The breaking point came 2 nights ago. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a faint noise. It was so subtle, I almost convinced myself it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, a soft scraping sound, like metal on wood. My heart raced as I realized it was coming from the back door. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering to the operator that someone was trying to break in. As I waited for the police, I armed myself with the closest thing I could find, a heavy lamp from the living room. The scraping stopped, and for a few agonizing minutes, there was silence. Then a shadow moved past the kitchen window. I clutched the lamp tighter, ready to defend myself, but before anything happened, red and blue lights flooded my driveway. The police arrived just in time. They found footprints in the dirt near my back door and confirmed someone had been trying to jimmy the lock, but whoever it was had vanished into the night. I packed a bag that same night and haven't been back to my house since. I'm staying in a hotel for now, constantly looking over my shoulder. To the man who keeps finding me, wherever you are, I don't know what you want, but I'll do everything in my power to make sure we never meet again. This happened a few years ago, and to this day, I still can't explain what I saw, or rather, who I saw. It was the fall, just before Halloween, and my boyfriend at the time, Alex, and I decided to go for a drive in the countryside. There's something peaceful about cruising past endless fields of corn and pumpkins, especially when the weather is cool and crisp. We had no real destination in mind, just a tank full of gas and a playlist of spooky podcasts to keep us entertained. As the sun started to set, we realized we were pretty far from the main road. The paved streets had turned to gravel, and soon we were surrounded by tall cornfields on both sides. There wasn't a house or street light in sight. We were joking about how cliche it would be to break down in a place like this when Alex suddenly slowed the car. "What's that?" he said, pointing to the right. I followed his gaze, squinting through the golden light of the setting sun. At first, I didn't see anything, just rows of corn swaying in the wind. But then, I noticed it. A man was standing in the middle of the field. He was facing us, perfectly still, with his arms at his sides. He wore a dirty brown jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. I couldn't see his features, but something about his posture gave me the chills. He didn't look like a farmer or anyone who had a reason to be out there. Probably just a scarecrow, Alex said, laughing nervously. But even as he said it, I could tell he wasn't convinced. Neither was I. "Scarecrows don't move," I whispered it, as if on cue. The man tilted his head slightly to the side. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to send my heart racing. "Drive," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Alex hesitated for a moment, but then he nodded and pressed the gas. We didn't look back. We drove for a few more miles in tense silence before we finally saw a sign pointing us back to the highway. Relief washed over me as we left the cornfields behind, and I convinced myself it was just some weird local playing a prank. That was until a few weeks later. I was scrolling through Facebook when a news story caught my eye. It was about a string of disappearances in rural areas near where we had been driving that night. The police had no leads, but witnesses reported seeing a man in a brown jacket and a wide-brimmed hat lurking near the fields. After seeing the news story, I couldn't shake the image of that man from my mind. The way he stood there, so still, yet so ominously alive, it haunted me. I told Alex about the article, hoping he'd brush it off and reassure me that it was just a coincidence. But his reaction only made things worse. "Do you think he was watching us?" he asked after a long pause. The question sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't thought about it that way, but the idea that he might have been standing there, waiting for someone to notice him, made my stomach turn. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he was just a harmless eccentric. Maybe it really was some kind of prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. About a week later, I started hearing strange noises at night. At first, it was just little things, branches rustling against the window or the faint sound of footsteps outside. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, and I figured it was just animals or my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it got worse. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a tapping sound on the glass. My heart was pounding as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and far too human. I mustered the courage to pull back the curtain, but there was nothing there. Just the empty yard bathed in moonlight. I told myself it was probably a tree branch, even though I knew there weren't any near that window. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside. They were large, too large to belong to anyone in my household, and they led straight to my window before disappearing back into the woods behind the house. I called Alex, freaking out, but he tried to calm me down. "It's probably just some kids messing around," he said. "They probably think it's funny," but it didn't feel funny. The following night, I stayed awake, determined to catch whoever it was. I sat by the window with my phone in hand, ready to call the police. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as I was about to give up, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was him, the same dirty brown jacket, the same wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move, didn't come closer, he just stood there, staring at the house. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his gaze. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial dial 911. When the police arrived, the man was gone. They searched the area and found nothing except for those same large footprints leading to my window and back to the woods. They told me to keep my doors locked and call if I saw anything else, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. I stayed with Alex for a few days after that, too scared to be alone. But even at his house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow outside the window made my heart race. Eventually, I moved out of that house and into an apartment in the city, hoping to put some distance between me and whatever or whoever was out there. It's been years now, and I haven't seen him again. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that man in the cornfield. I think about how he stood there, waiting, watching, and I wonder, was I just unlucky enough to see him, or was I exactly who he was waiting for? Life in the city helped me regain a sense of normalcy, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't still glance over my shoulder or triple check the locks on my door every night. For a while, I even stopped watching true crime shows or reading anything remotely spooky. My nerves were shot, and I didn't want to feed the paranoia. Then, about 6 months after I moved, I got a letter. It came in a plain, unmarked envelope with no return address. My stomach dropped when I saw it because I hadn't given anyone my new address except close friends and family. At first, I told myself it was just junk mail, but when I opened it, I found a single piece of paper folded neatly in half. On the paper was a crudely drawn picture of a cornfield. In the middle of the field stood a figure in a wide-brimmed hat. There were no words, no signature, just the drawing. My hands were shaking as I held it, and I immediately felt like I couldn't breathe. I called the police, but they weren't much help. They said without a postmark or any identifying information, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I install a security system and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. That was it. For weeks, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that drawing. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, certain that if I looked out the window, I'd see him standing there. But nothing happened. No more letters, no strange noises, nothing. Eventually, I started to believe that maybe it was over, until I saw him again. I was walking home from work one evening, taking a shortcut through a quiet side street. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. I was halfway down the block when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. I stopped in my tracks and glanced around. The street was empty, or so I thought, and then I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the street, partially obscured by a lamppost. The same wide-brimmed hat, the same brown jacket. My blood ran cold. He wasn't moving, but I knew he saw me. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was inside my building, the door locked behind me. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. That was the last time I saw him, but the fear never left. Every time I walk alone, every time I hear an unexpected noise in the night, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to show himself again. To the man at the cornfield, who somehow found me even in the city, let's not meet. Ever. And if we do, I don't think I'll be the one running next time. I was in college at the time, working late nights at a diner to help pay my tuition. Most nights, I didn't leave until after midnight, and my apartment was a solid 20-minute drive from the diner. Usually, the drive home was uneventful, quiet roads, sleepy towns, but this night was different. It started with my car acting up. The check engine light had been on for weeks, but as a broke college student, I was hoping to put off repairs until my next paycheck. That night, as I pulled out of the diner parking lot, my car sputtered and stalled at a red light. I managed to restart it, but something about the way it sounded made me uneasy. I stopped at a 24-hour gas station about halfway home to grab a drink and calm my nerves. The station was mostly empty, except for a white van parked at the far end of the lot. I didn't think much of it at first. White vans are everywhere, right? I went inside, grabbed a soda, and chatted briefly with the cashier, an older man who seemed nice enough. When I walked back out, I noticed the van was now parked closer to my car. Again, I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. I got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out, I saw the van's headlights flicker on behind me. At this point, I started to get that sinking feeling in my stomach. The van stayed a few car lengths behind me as I drove down the main road. When I turned onto the quieter street leading to my apartment, it turned too. I thought maybe it was a coincidence, but then I decided to test it. I made an unnecessary left turn into a random residential neighborhood. Sure enough, the van followed me. Panic set in. I started running through my options. Should I call the police? Should I speed up and hope to lose them? My car, with its engine issues, wasn't exactly built for a high-speed chase. Instead, I decided to head for a well-lit grocery store parking lot that I knew had security cameras. As I pulled in, I parked right in front of the store and turned off my car. The van rolled slowly into the lot but didn't park. Instead, it crept along the row of cars, passing mine before stopping a few spaces down. I couldn't couldn't see the driver through the tinted windows, but I could feel their eyes on me. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. I grabbed my phone and pretended to call someone, hoping it would scare them off. A moment later, the van suddenly backed out of the space and sped out of the parking lot. I stayed parked there for another 20 minutes, too shaken to move. When I finally got home, I double-checked all my locks and slept with the lights on. The scariest part, the next morning, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. I hadn't seen it in the dark the night before. It was a crudely written note. "You're lucky you stopped." The note said to chill down my spine. I held it in my hand, staring at the words over and over as though they'd change if I looked hard enough. The handwriting was messy, almost childlike, and the letters were smudged. I couldn't figure out how long it had been there. Had they left it before I went into the store or after I got out? Either way, it was clear they had been watching me for longer than I realized. I threw the note away immediately, but the sense of being followed didn't leave me. That day, I told my roommate, Sarah, about what happened. She tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a weird coincidence or someone trying to mess with me. Still, she offered to come with me the next time I needed to make a late night drive, which was comforting. For a while, things went back to normal. I avoided late night shifts when I could, stuck to main roads, and kept my car locked at all times. I'd even scraped together enough money to get my car fixed. I thought I was being paranoid, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. Weeks passed without incident, and I started to feel like maybe it was just a one-off creepy experience. Until it wasn't. About 2 months later, I got home from a late shift around midnight. As I walked up the stairs to my apartment, I noticed something on the floor near my door, a small, folded piece of paper. My heart dropped. It was the same kind of paper as before, and the same messy handwriting. "You didn't see me this time." I froze. Someone had been outside my apartment, watching me. The thought made my skin crawl. How had they found me? Had they been following me this entire time? My hand shook as I unlocked the door and bolted it shut behind me. Sarah was already asleep, so I decided not to wake her. Instead, I stayed up all night, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I filed a police report. They took it seriously, but without any solid leads, there wasn't much they could do. The officer who came to our apartment suggested getting a security camera, which we did the very next day. I also started parking my car in a different spot each night, hoping to throw off whoever was watching me. For a while, the camera footage showed nothing unusual. I checked it obsessively every morning, half hoping and half dreading that I'd catch something. Then, about a week later, I found what I was looking for. At 3:17 a.m., the camera captured a figure walking slowly down the hallway outside our apartment. They were wearing a hoodie, the hood pulled up so I couldn't see their face, and they stopped directly in front of our door. They stood there for almost a full minute before slipping something under the door and walking away. I didn't even want to pick up the paper, but I forced myself to. This time, it wasn't a note. It was a Polaroid photo of me. It looked like it had been taken through my car window, probably on one of those nights I'd worked late. The realization that they'd been close enough to take a photo made me feel sick. I showed the police the footage and the photo. This time, they took it very seriously. They increased patrols in my area and suggested I stay somewhere else for a while. Sarah and I ended up crashing at a friend's place for a few weeks, and I eventually moved out of that apartment entirely. I never found out who he was. The police said they didn't have enough evidence to track the person down, and as far as I know, they never caught them. To this day, I don't know if it was someone I knew, a random stalker, or something else entirely. I've since moved to a new city, changed my number, and been much more cautious about my surroundings. Even though I had moved cities and taken every precaution I could think of, the fear never really went away. I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, scanning parking lots, and avoiding being alone in unfamiliar places. For months, I slept with a chair wedged under my new apartment door handle and a can of pepper spray within arm's reach. Things started to get better over time, though. I found a job in my new city that didn't require late night shifts, and I made a few friends who helped me feel more at ease. I even started dating someone, a guy named Ryan, who was patient with my paranoia and never made me feel silly for being extra cautious. I began to feel normal again, like the nightmare was finally behind me. Then, about a year after I'd moved, it happened again. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Ryan and I were at a local coffee shop. We picked a table near the back, tucked away from the busier seating areas. As we sipped our drinks and chatted, I noticed a man sitting alone at a table near the window. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face, and he had a laptop open in front of him. Nothing about him screamed suspicious. If anything, he looked like he was just catching up on some work. But something about him made my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off and focus on my conversation with Ryan, but every so often, I glanced toward the man. At one point, I swore I caught him looking at me. Not a casual glance. This was different. He quickly looked back at his laptop, but it was enough to put me on edge. cottage. When we finished our drinks and got up to leave, I couldn't resist glancing back one more time. The man was staring directly at me now, his expression blank but intense. My stomach flipped. I grabbed Ryan's arm and whispered, "Let's go." We left the coffee shop, and I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. He was just a random guy. He probably wasn't even looking at me. But then, as we walked back to my car, I felt that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned around and saw the man standing just outside the coffee shop door, staring after us. He didn't follow, but he didn't go back inside either. He just stood there, watching until we were out of sight. I told Ryan about what had happened, and he suggested we swing by the police station, just in case. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what I expected them to do. When we arrived, I described the man as best as I could and gave them the address of the coffee shop. The officer at the desk said they'd look into it, but reminded me that unless the man had done something illegal, there wasn't much they could do. The next morning, I found a familiar sight on my windshield, a piece of paper tucked neatly under the wiper blade. My hand shook as I unfolded it. The note was short and to the point. "I found you." I broke down crying in the middle of the parking lot. Ryan had to help me back into the apartment, where I called the police again. They came out to take another report, but just like before, there wasn't much they could do. They recommended more security measures, but I could tell they didn't think they'd catch whoever was behind this. Since that day, I've been living in a constant state of anxiety. I changed my routines, switched my job again, and even moved to a new apartment with a more secure building. I don't go anywhere alone if I can help it, and I've become hyper aware of my surroundings. Ryan has been a rock through all of this, but I know it's taken a toll on him too. It's been a few months now, and I haven't had any new incidents. I want to believe it's over, that whoever this person is has given up or moved on, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. To the man in the coffee shop, or whoever has been following me all these years, please, for the sake of my sanity, let's not meet again, ever. I was hiking alone on a popular mountain trail in late autumn. It was one of those crisp, perfect days where the air smells like pine and the leaves crunch satisfyingly underfoot. The trail I chose wasn't the busiest one. It veered off into a more secluded area about halfway up the mountain. I liked the solitude, and I was well prepared, plenty of water, snacks, and a map. I had done this hike before, so I wasn't worried. About 3 miles into the trail, I noticed something unusual. There were faint footprints in the dirt, heading in the same direction as me. They looked fresh, but I hadn't seen anyone ahead of me all day. I brushed it off. Maybe someone was moving quickly or had turned back before I arrived. As I continued, the atmosphere began to change. The woods, usually alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, felt eerily quiet. The further I walked, the heavier the silence became, pressing down like a weight. Then I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. Slowly, I turned, scanning the trail and the woods. There was no one there. I told myself it was probably just an animal and kept moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About half an hour later, I reached a clearing where the trail forked. I stopped to check my map when I heard it again. This time, the sound of deliberate footsteps crunching the leaves behind me. They were slow and methodical, like someone was trying to approach quietly. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but my gut screamed otherwise. I decided to take the fork that looped back toward the main trail. As I picked up my pace, the footsteps behind me quickened. They weren't far now. Whoever it was, they weren't even trying to hide anymore. I broke into a jog, my heart pounding as the footsteps got louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I could hear whoever it was breathing now, ragged and heavy, like they were right on my heels. Suddenly, I spotted another hiker ahead of me, a man in his 50 seconds with a bright red jacket. Without thinking, I sprinted toward him, shouting, "Hey, wait up." The man turned, startled, as I reached him, panting and wild-eyed. "Are you okay?" he asked. I glanced behind me. The footsteps had stopped. There was no one there. "I think someone's following me," I stammered, struggling to catch my breath. The man immediately became serious and stayed with me as we walked back to the main trail. He had a walking stick and seemed ready to use it if necessary. I kept looking over my shoulder, but we didn't see anyone the rest of the way down. When we reached the parking lot, I finally felt a sliver of relief. I thanked the man profusely and got into my car, locking the doors immediately. As I started to drive away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and froze. There, standing at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. They didn't move, didn't wave. They just stood there, watching as I sped out of the lot. The following weeks were a blur of unease. Every time I left my house, I felt like someone was watching me. I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, I never actually saw the person again, but the feeling wouldn't go away. One night, about 2 weeks later, I was home alone. I live in a small house with a decent-sized yard, bordered by thick woods. It's peaceful, but suddenly that isolation didn't feel so comforting. It started around 9 p.m. I was watching TV TV when I heard a faint tapping sound at the back of the house. My heart sank. At first, I thought it was just a branch hitting the window in the wind, but when I muted the TV, the tapping continued. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I grabbed my phone and crept to the kitchen window, which faces the backyard. The blinds were closed, but there was a tiny gap between them. As I peeked out, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. A figure was standing just beyond the edge of the porch, partially obscured by the shadows. They weren't moving, but their posture was unsettling, rigid and tense, as if they were waiting for something. I stumbled back, my hand shaking as I dialed 911. The dispatcher was calm, assuring me that an officer would be sent immediately. I stayed on the line, crouched behind the counter, heart hammering in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of a car pulling into my driveway. I bolted to the front door and flung it open, relief flooding me when I saw the police officer stepping out of his vehicle. But when I tried to explain what had happened and led him to the backyard, the figure was gone. The officer shone his flashlight around, revealing footprints in the dirt, large ones leading from the edge of the woods to my porch. He followed them to where the figure had been standing and found something that made my stomach churn. There was a small knife, its blade stuck into the wooden railing of my porch, and a note tied to the handle. The officer carefully untied it and read it aloud. Next time, I won't just watch. I moved out of that house a week later, breaking my lease and relocating to a different state. It was an impulsive decision, but I didn't care. Whatever it took to feel safe again. After moving, things finally started to settle down. I found a new place in a small, busy neighborhood, a stark contrast to the quiet isolation of my old house. The streets were always alive with activity, and having people around made me feel safer. Slowly, I started to let my guard down, convincing myself that whatever happened back then was over. For the first few months, everything was fine. I got a new job, made some friends, and started to feel normal again. But then, one evening, I came home from work and found something that made my stomach drop. On my doorstep was a small, plain package with no return address. At first, I thought it might be a mistake, maybe something delivered to the wrong house. But when I opened it, my hands began to shake. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message scrawled in messy handwriting. Found you. I felt like the walls were closing in around me. Hell, how could they have found me? I'd been so careful. I hadn't told anyone from my old life where I'd gone, and I hadn't even updated my social media. Panicking, I called the police again. They took the package and the note, promising to investigate, but I could tell they weren't optimistic about finding anything. After all, there were no fingerprints, no camera footage from my street, and no other leads. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside felt amplified, a car passing, a dog barking, the faint rustle of wind through the trees. I was terrified that I'd wake up to find that figure outside my window again. Over the next few weeks, strange things kept happening, small, almost imperceptible at first. My mail would go missing, even though I'd see the carrier drop it off. Lights in my house would flicker, though the electrician found nothing wrong. My neighbors mentioned seeing someone unfamiliar lingering near my house late at night, a tall figure wearing dark clothing, but they could never give a clear description. Then, one night, it escalated. I was in bed when I woke up to the sound of my front doorknob jiggling. My heart froze. Someone was trying to get inside. I grabbed my phone and quietly called 911, whispering to the dispatcher what was happening. The jiggling stopped, but then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, walking around to the back of the house. I stayed on the line, barely breathing, until I heard the sirens in the distance. The dispatcher assured me the officers were almost there. When the flashing red and blue lights finally lit up my street, I felt a wave of relief so strong I nearly cried. The police didn't find anyone, but they did find scratch marks on my back door, as if someone had been trying to pry it open. That was the final straw. I packed my things and moved again, this time to a high-rise apartment with 24/7 security. It's been 3 years since then, and there haven't been any more incidents. I've tried to put it behind me, but I still feel uneasy whenever I'm alone. Every now and then, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if they're still out there, watching. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.